So good afternoon from Vienna and good morning to New Hampshire. Welcome to today's edition of the FIW-Trade Talks, which is an online event series in which we are discussing pressing questions on trade and economic policies with internationally outstanding scientists and scholars. My name is Harald Oberhofer and I'm the host of today's FIW-Trade Talks. The Trade Talks are financially supported by the Austrian Ministry of Labor and Economy, for which we are very grateful. Before jumping into our topic, let me just briefly remind those of you who have not yet been in an FIW Trade Talk about our housekeeping rules for the Trade Talks. So the structure is as follows. The Trade Talk starts with an input of our guest, which lasts about 15 to 20 minutes. And after that, we will have around another 40 minutes to further discuss the topic of the day. You can participate in the discussion by posting your questions and comments into the Q&A section here in Zoom, and I will pick up your questions and hand them over to our guest. Finally, after the seminar, you will receive a short feedback questionnaire. I would kindly like to ask you to give us some feedback because we're always eager to continuously improve our events in general and the Trade Talks in particular. Now, having said that, I would now like to come to our topic of today. Today's Trade Talk is on 75 years of GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. The GATT went into force on January the 1st, 1948 with 23 members, and its successor today, the World Trade Organization, has about 164 members, so a quite substantial extension, enlargement of the GATT and its successor over the last 75 years. I'm very happy to welcome Douglas A. Irwin as our guest speaker to discuss the topic of 75 years of GATT. Douglas Irwin is John French Professor of Economics at the Dartmouth College. He's also research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research and a non-residential senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Currently, Professor Irwin also serves as president of the Economic History Association. Douglas Irwin studied at the University of New Hampshire and at the Columbia University, where he also obtained his PhD. He also has quite some background in trade policy work. He worked on trade policy issues while on the staff of President Ronald Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors. And later on, he worked in the International Finance Division at the Board of Governance of the Federal Reserve System in Washington, D.C. Before joining Dartmouth College, Douglas Irwin taught at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. In his research, Douglas Irwin studies trade policy issues from an economic history point of view. He's author and co-author of many very well-known books. I have a couple of them in back of myself, just including mentioning some of the books. One is Clashing Over Commerce, A History of U.S. Trade Policy, which The Economist and the Foreign Affairs selected as one of their best books of the years. He also published, of course, scientific papers, but some other books that are very prominent include Free Trade Under Fire, or Trade Policy Disaster Lessons from the 1930s, or Against the Tide, an intellectual history of free trade. And for the topic of today, maybe the most fitting book is The Genesis of the GATT. I could not imagine anyone better fitting for talking about 75 years of GATT. Doug, it's my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you in this FIW Trade Talk. And with this, I would like to hand over the virtual floor to you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Obviously, I wish I was in Austria eating strudel and hanging out on the Ringstrasse in person, but this is a second best opportunity for me to share some thoughts on the 75 years that the GATT has been in existence, where it's been, where it's going, and questions of the sort. So I'm going to share some slides that I hope you can see. And let's see. Where to start? I want, if you're interested in this topic, let's see if I can move on to the next slide here. Two good books would be The one that you mentioned that I co-authored with Petros Mavroidis and Alan Sykes on the genesis of the GATT, the first chapter of which covers a lot of the history leading up to the formation of the GATT in 1947. That's freely available on my website. If you just Google Douglas.Irwin at Dartmouth, you can find it there. But there's also a more recent book that's also important by Francine McKenzie, a historian at the University of Western Ontario in Canada, called GATT and the Global Order in the Post-War Era. And that's less on the legal side, less on the economic side, more on the politics of the GATT. So I highly recommend that book as well. So why did the United States and these 23 countries decide to create the GATT in 1947? Well, this is my picture that sort of shows the evolution of globalization since the late 19th century. And there really have been 5 phases of globalization. The first one is the late 19th century. You can see that right in here. This is the trade to GDP ratio of the world. So it's showing the degree of economic integration. You can see it's sort of upward sloping. We had the steamship. We had some tariff reductions across Western Europe. Those leading to this increased integration. But the reason why we have the GATT is because of this second period right here, where we see international integration declining. This was a period, of course, of World War I, followed by the chaos of the 1920s, followed by the Great Depression of the 1930s, followed by World War II. So we had 4 really big negative shocks to global trade and integration. And during this period, we saw a rise in protectionism. So if we just look at what happened during the Great Depression, this is one of the world's largest trade shocks, negative trade shocks ever experienced in history, where the volume of world trade fell by a full 25% between 1929 and 1932. So this is just a huge shock to the global economy. Obviously, there were bank failures, rising unemployment. It was a worldwide phenomenon. Half of this decline in the volume of world trade is due to protectionism. And I'll mention some of those features in just a moment, but this far exceeds what we saw in the 1970s, early 1980s, or even the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009, when only 2% of the reduction in trade value was due to globalization. And then, of course, COVID was another large shock, but didn't see so much protectionism. But really, this period was remarkable. And actually, this is from I believe it's an Austrian research institute that first came up with this chart, the declining spiral of world trade. It was picked up by the League of Nations and published in the League of Nations Economic Survey for 1933, I believe. And now a lot of this decline in world trade is due to deflation, the fall in prices. But as I just showed in the previous chart, there had been a substantial decline in the volume of trade as well. So the 1930s was really a terrible period for the whole global economy and world trade in particular. So here's sort of just a sketch of what happened. This is just showing you the volume of world exports, which is the blue line, the volume of world production, which is the red line. And we can see that prior to World War I, their two are sort of going hand in hand. 1920s, they also grew hand in hand, but there's this divergence. World production jumped back from the Great Depression, but world trade did not. World trade remained sort of depressed. And the reason, you were kind to mention, I have this other book called Trade Policy Disaster, Lessons from the 1930s. And with the decline in demand, aggregate demand, due to the macroeconomic shock of the Great Depression, we saw this worldwide outbreak of protectionism. We saw higher tariffs. We saw import quotas. We saw foreign exchange controls, preferential trade arrangements, all sorts of measures to limit, restrict, and reshape global trade, partly for protectionist purposes, partly for geopolitical purposes. You want to trade with your allies and not enemies and things of that sort. And the US bears a little bit of blame for this turn in this direction. And I don't know whether your audience has heard of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, the Tariff Act of 1930. These are the two gentlemen that sort of shepherded this legislation through Congress, Willis Hawley and Reed Smoot. They were very important figures at the time. One was the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee. The other was the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, and they were responsible for moving trade legislation through Congress. And they passed this bill that raised US tariffs to a significant degree in 1930 and led to a lot of retaliation by European countries, South American countries, and others against the US, which contributed to that downward spiral of trade. So what's interesting, economists sort of knew what was going to be going on during this period. So over 1,000 US economists asked President Herbert Hoover to veto the bill, but he did not. He accepted what his party delivered through Congress. This is really in an era, a different era in which Congress really controlled trade policy, not the president. And once again, if you're interested in that, I have another book just on the Smoot-Hawley tariff, the Great Depression, some of the international repercussions. Well, as a result of the Great Depression, President Hoover was not reelected. It's very difficult to get reelected when the unemployment rate's 30% or so. And in comes President Franklin Roosevelt, who wanted to do something different in terms of trade policy. And one of the people he hired in his administration to help out was the Secretary of State at the time, Cordell Hull, who's not so much remembered, but he was long-standing serving US Secretary of State. And he, as a result of World War I, believed that freer trade and international cooperation and better relations went all hand in hand. And so this is a representative quote of his, that he will never falter in his belief that enduring peace and the welfare of nations are indissolubly connected with friendliness, fairness, equality, and the maximum practical degree of freedom in international trade. So he saw that freer trade was not just good economically, but it was good in terms of foreign relations as well. And having a more prosperous world economy would be important moving forward from the depths of the 1930s. So he and the Roosevelt administration helped Congress pass this piece of legislation, which, notice, just a little amendment to that Smoot-Hawley Act called the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. This is a very short report, but what it did is fundamentally and profoundly change US trade policy and hence trade policies around the world. So this delegated negotiating powers to the president. Prior to this time, this is passed in 1934. Prior to this time, Congress controlled trade policy. Congress did not negotiate with other countries, but now the president could exert greater leadership with respect to international trade policies. And this fundamentally changed the politics of US trade policy, because what it did was allow exporters to have a say in terms of the administration and Congress, in terms of saying, we would like better market access abroad for our products that we're going to export. Congress before, they would just set the schedule of import duties. Exporters were not really involved in that process. So Congress only heard from competing producers who are complaining against foreign competition. So this really changed things. So what Hull did as Secretary of State is in the 1930s reach about a dozen or so trade agreements, reciprocal agreements. They were bilateral. There was some question about whether they should seek some multilateral agreement at this time. There was a World Economic Conference in 1933, which utterly failed to show any sort of consensus on where to move forward with trade policy. So the US said the time is not ripe for multilateral trade initiatives. We'll do this bilaterally in these reciprocal trade agreements. And here is just something we reproduce from that book, The Genesis of the GATT. These are the general provisions of these reciprocal trade agreements. And if you just go down this list, most favored nation clause, internal taxes, quotas, exchange control, concessions, this looks very much like the GATT in terms of its early articles. In fact, this is sort of a prototype. The US is practicing, if you will, with various countries on these things. Territorial application, general reservations. I mean, these are all things that are in the GATT, and they were in these reciprocal trade agreements. And so what, as we'll sort of see in a moment, is the GATT sort of grew out of this experiment in the United States with these reciprocal trade agreements. Well, World War II stopped all these reciprocal trade agreements. There's no real point in trade agreements during war. But after the war, the United States, once again, is sort of part of this effort to build the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the Bretton Woods institutions here, international cooperation with the UN, also wanted an ITO, an International Trade Organization, to be the anchor in terms of the trade relationships. And so in November of 1945, a little bit later than these earlier initiatives, the US released a proposal for the expansion of world trade and employment. I don't have a copy here on my desk, unfortunately, otherwise I'd show it to you. I do have a copy of Smoot-Hawley in my bookcase behind me, but that's not of great interest. But this is the proposal saying that we want to multilateralize have a global arrangement that sort of would bring all these reciprocal trade agreements together. And once again, not dictate free trade, not tell countries what their trade policies ought to be, but to first of all have some rules about what those policies ought to be in terms of non-discrimination and how you can apply your tariffs, and then try to negotiate to bring down all the protectionist measures that had grown up during the 1930s. So this was first discussed at Church House in London in 1946, about a year after the US released those proposals. So unlike the US, the UN and the IMF, the GATT and the WTO, the ITO were not sort of quickly accomplished. But there were these various negotiations to sort of bring things to fruition. Well, the only reason why I mentioned this London meeting in 1946, which is obviously a year before the GATT negotiations, is Canada came up with a very important proposal. The US had envisioned something like the United Nations for trade. That is, all countries, every country around the world, we're all going to get together and we're going to negotiate about trade policy. And it was Canada who said, you know what, that may not be a good idea, because not every country is sort of on the same page in terms of trade policy. Obviously, there's the Soviet bloc, there's Latin America. Some countries want heavy protection for infant industry reasons or to industrialize. Other countries, such as the Netherlands and Belgium, really want much more open trade. And we'll never reach an agreement if we all have these different views. So Canada's suggestion was, let's start with a small group of countries that basically all are on the same page, want to liberalize trade, and let's do that. The US usually doesn't take advice from other countries very well, but this somehow struck the US as a good approach. So the US adopted this and said, well, we'll go for a general agreement on tariffs and trade first, and then we'll go for this ITO, which will be the big multilateral world organization that we'll do. So that led to the Geneva Conference in 1947. And here's just some of the early documents. And what is this? Article 1 on the MFN. There's just a draft of the GATT, and there were various drafts that were kicked around and negotiated. And here it is, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And this is February 1947. So once again, sort of the start of the negotiations. And of course, the negotiations take place in, oops, if I can move on here, in Geneva from April to October of 1947. What's interesting about this, of course, is that it just took 6 months, 7 months or so to wrap up the negotiations, even though they were very, very contentious, unlike the trade negotiations, which are very complex today and go on year after year. Here's just the negotiating room where the ministers are meeting. Once again, as you mentioned, it was only about 23 countries at this initial meeting, so it was pretty small. And there were some difficulties. The main difficulty was between the US and Great Britain, two great powers at the time. So here's Will Clayton, who's the US negotiator, and here is Stafford Cribs, the British negotiator, head of the Board of Trade. The main issue was not so much the tariff cuts, but tariff preferences. So Britain at this time still has its colonies and still want to give preferences to its colonies. But of course, Article 1 of the GATT is non-discrimination. So immediately you're arguing about Article 1. So they sort of worked that out, and we got the GATT in 1947. I'll come back to the GATT in a moment, but I just want to do a brief detour to this ITO, which maybe you never heard of before. That's because it didn't come into existence. So the US said, we're not satisfied with the GATT. We really want a global trade arrangement. So in 1948, there was a meeting in Havana, and that was going to say, okay, we have this GATT, but let's expand it, make it bigger, encompass more countries, have more articles that will deal with more issues such as commodities and what have you. Here's the negotiation in Geneva. Here's a book by the US chief negotiator, Claire Wilcox, and he talks about how this really all fell apart. And it fell apart for precisely the reasons that Canada had suggested originally to the United States. If you get 90 or 100 countries together, as there were at the time, there's just no real consensus about what trade policy ought to be. And so you're not going to get anywhere. You're not going to get very much agreement on rules. And this, I should say, is important to raise because it will come back to us when we talk about the WTO in just a moment, about what happens when you get a lot of different countries involved in the same room. So the rationale for this was not just economics, that we want to restore world prosperity, but also peace. So Franklin Roosevelt said this: we cannot succeed in building a peaceful world unless we also have an economically healthy world. That was a sort of a fundamental motivation. President Harry Truman, who succeeded President Roosevelt, said this right at the beginning, beginning of the, let's see if I can get rid of that. Right at the beginning of the negotiations in 1947, that people are worried about peace and freedom. And these objectives are bound up complete with a third objective, the reestablishment of world trade. In fact, the three, peace, freedom, and world trade, are inseparable. The grave lessons of the past have proved it. So that's this idea that we need to do this not just because there are economic benefits, but because a flourishing world economy will be very helpful. And this wasn't just a US idea. James Meade, who was a key, later won the Nobel Prize in Economics, was a British trade negotiator, had written this book in 1940, The Economic Basis of a Durable Peace. And so that was the formation of the European Economic Community and so many institutions at this time. And one of my favorite cartoons just sort of illustrates this, is here we have trade freedom, and it's holding up political cooperation, which is holding up world peace. And then we have on the sideline off stage here, the tariff lobby shooting peas or darts or something at trade freedom, trying to interfere with this. But the view was that if we let trade freedom go, we're going to jeopardize political cooperation and possibly jeopardize world peace. And I think it's also important to mention this because this is one of the glues that held the GATT together for so many years in US leadership. And we're in a very different world today, unfortunately. Okay, so let's see. Here's just one more a postage stamp in the US indicating this world trade through world peace. And there's one more thing. Of course, I think your audience is very aware of what the GATT is about and its various provisions. All of its principles, in some sense, are trying to set down what we aspire to in terms of a trade agreement, not exactly what will always happen with countries. So non-discrimination and MFN was considered most important, of course, but there's exceptions to that. The idea was to only have countries use tariffs and get rid of quantitative restrictions. We very much succeeded in doing that in Europe by the end of the 1950s, but not in the rest of the world. That took much longer time. And of course, these negotiations, so the GATT was not just in place and ended, there would be these ongoing negotiations. I'm sure the listenership or those who are watching are also aware that the first round in 1947 did substantially reduce tariffs, 26%. So that was a very big, substantial contribution. But there are a whole bunch of subsequent rounds which reduced tariffs much smaller extent, but really expanded the membership. So Japan was able to join in the mid-1950s, and other countries began to accede as they saw this pact is working at expanding world trade. Then three big rounds: the 1960s, the Kennedy round; 1970s, the Tokyo round, also pretty big tariff cuts there. And then the last major round of the GATT, the Uruguay round, another big tariff reduction. But notice the list sort of stops here. Now, we do, of course, create the WTO, and I'll talk about that in just one second before I wrap up. These last three ones were pretty big. In work with Chad Bound at the Peterson Institute, we tried to figure out how much exactly did the GATT reduce these tariffs. The World Bank had said at some point that world tariffs after World War II are about 40% on average. And what we did, we found no basis for that claim. So we backcast based on the tariff cuts that we saw. And tariffs after the war were probably about 22% or so. But because of the GATT in Western Europe, United States, North America, Japan, and elsewhere, they brought them down to less than 5%. So it's not quite as dramatic as some had claimed, but it is the steady erosion of tariffs and then moving into non-tariff barriers that is really the GATT's contribution. And of course, what we can see is that here's this interwar period that's really creating the GATT. The GATT sort of flourished in this period 3 when we get this upward movement. in integration. But really things don't pick up until 1980 to 1990 when we shift into the Uruguay round and the WTO. And this is partly because more and more countries began to adopt freer trade policies during this period here. In period 3, which is sort of the heyday of the GATT, it's really just Western Europe, North America, Japan, and a few others. It did not include the whole world economy. Because as you know, the Uruguay round was a big round because it did include many more countries in the world. It also encompassed the period when the Berlin Wall fell, so Eastern European countries want to be involved. And of course, the Uruguay round did a number of things. This is just taken from a WTO document. You don't really have to read it, but it's not just the GATT anymore. Under the WTO, there's the Agreement on Agriculture, Agreement on Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures, Technical Barriers to Trade, TPT, TRIMS, Trade-related Investment, Agreement on Anti-Dumping, Customs Evaluations, all these other General Agreement on Trade and Services, all these other agreements. So the scope of what happened during the Uruguay round really expanded. And so the new WTO oversees many, many more agreements. The GATT is just one of them. Here, of course, is the WTO building in Geneva. I always recommend visiting it and talking to people there. There's one of the negotiating rooms, and as you can see, it's much bigger than it was in the heyday of the GATT. And herein lies sort of the problem that we've reached after the Uruguay round. And some have called it a trilemma. That is, we're asking too much of the world trading system, and we can only achieve 2 of these 3 desirable features. So one thing that the GATT and the WTO has always operated on consensus. And what that means is that nothing will really go through and become implemented unless all members are basically on board. Well, it's very hard to get 162 countries to agree on a common framework. So that's difficult enough. But also the goal has been uniform rules. So we don't have some set of rules for a certain set of countries and another set of rules for others. Well, to get consensus on uniform rules, that's a very difficult thing to do. It was much easier when you just had the 23 countries or Western European and North American countries where we have market economies basically wanted free enterprise and competition. Then also strict enforcement. This is something the US insisted and other countries did too, as in the Uruguay round, where there was a fear at the end of the 1970s and into the 1980s that the GATT was just not, there were words, but there's no enforcement mechanism. You couldn't make countries adhere to its provisions. So all these 3 things are considered desirable, but it's really hard to have all of them in the same package at the same time. And so the idea would be you could have consensus and strict enforcement, but then you can't really have uniform rules. Or you could have consensus and uniform rules, but then you can't really strictly enforce them. Or you could have enforcement and uniform rules, but then you're not really going to have a consensus on that. So you're trying to get too many things into this one organization. So I'll just end by talking about the difficulties in terms of the Doha round, which was ultimately declared a failure in the WTO, and the failure of the WTO to reach any agreement since 1995. A couple of people saw this coming. So Dan Tarullo, who is a trade negotiator in the Clinton administration, and now a professor of law. He does more, he's moved away from trade law per se, but he wrote this article, I think in the year 2000 or right after the Doha was started. And he said the end of the big trade deal, and sort of going back to that trilemma, he thought we can't replicate what we did with the Uruguay round. The conditions are not just there for a new multilateral agreement. So there is a question about whether the WTO is so big and unwieldy like the ITO, and as Canada suggested, you can't get all these countries agreeing on trade policy. The other big change, of course, is China. And we can get into this with the Q&A, but one reason the GATT worked well and the WTO has had problems is the GATT was basically consisted of market-oriented economies. And now China, which joined around 2001, had been moving in a liberalizing direction under Deng Xiaoping, had been reducing tariffs, had been privatizing and getting rid of some state-owned enterprises, but has been moving back the other way. And the state is much more important in running the Chinese economy and much more pervasive. And because of its size, because of its growth, for various reasons, one could ask the question, as Susan Aronson did in this piece here, is China compatible with the WTO? Or is this trade arrangement not so flexible that it can accommodate such a large and different economy compared to what we had been used to with the GATT? So why don't I stop there and open up to a dialogue with you and any questions the audience might have.
Thank you so much, Doug. I think we have a lot of material to talk about after this great presentation. So thank you again for this insightful input from your side. So just a reminder to the audience, please write your questions and comments in the Q&A section. I will pick them up. Maybe let me start with a very general question. As we have the topic 75 years of GATT, so would you say it's a success story or is it a failure at the end of the day?
Oh, it's very much a success story because, first of all, it did work. It has worked for most of its existence in terms of facilitating the reduction of trade barriers, changing the domestic politics of trade in a way that facilitates trade liberalization, in a way that's not possible to do often when countries are on their own. Many countries, I mean, its success is measured in two ways. One is there are a number of econometric studies that show how much world trade has grown as a result of the GATT agreements. And that's positive and that's fairly substantial. So that adds to human welfare in and of itself. But then the fact that so many countries want to join and have used joining as a way of changing their own trade policies. And once again, just as the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act empowered exporters in the US, joining the GATT is a way of empowering exporters to counterbalance the pressure from import competing producers and giving the workers and the firms that export a say in what a country's trade policy will be. So I think on both of those sides, it's been a success. And even though the WTO hasn't achieved much positively moving forward, it has still provided the framework for open trade today, even though for reasons we can get into that system is fraying.
Before I'm coming to a first question from the audience, because I think this question is so broad and fits basically to everything you talked, and I was also thinking about. So it's kind of a lot of what can we learn from history for the future or the current situation. Just one little question on your last remarks regarding China, and liberalized to some part, but then it had a backlash to more state intervention in markets and basically gamed the WTO rules somehow. Wouldn't you say that this is a more general problem for multilateralism? So we now, at least in my impression, we see a lot of these industrial policy initiatives, also in very large market economies like the US, and we had the issue US versus European Union with the Inflation Reduction Act, which to a large degree is actually very active industrial policy from the US side. This is also an issue for the WTO, right? If countries start subsidizing new technologies, try to circumvent issues of the climate change by just putting a lot of state money into the economy, isn't it?
Yes. So I think one of the big things that's changed in the past 10 years, or certainly since the global financial crisis of 2008, is well, a couple of things have changed. One is that China's rise, which is a huge economic success, and once again, they want to join the WTO to become part of this system. It's also changed world geopolitics. So one reason why there was so much trade liberalization in the 1980s and 90s in particular, in the GATT, in the WTO, and outside of it, is that geopolitics was benign. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, Eastern European countries wanted to join. There's a sort of a ratcheting down of geopolitical tensions. We didn't fear nuclear war as much. China was just trying to get rich. Russia was just trying to stabilize and recover. And so the US was largely unchallenged. Now, I'd say with COVID, which has raised people's fears about dependency on others, the rise of China as a possible geopolitical threat, at least it's perceived that way in the US and maybe by some of its neighbors in Asia, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the idea that trade leads to peace, and leads to more cooperation. That doesn't seem to be working. The idea that trade is national security can take a second seat to trade or economic efficiency, that also has been being questioned. And so we're getting all the factors that were driving trade liberalization after World War II, they're unraveling in that way, and we're in a different world.
Yeah. So at least to some degree, the end of history, as people already said over the last years, right? So now let me bring in the question, because you already touched upon some of the topics. So the question is from Manfred Jekyllin from the Federal Ministry of Labor and Economy. First of all, he thanks you a lot for the very interesting presentation. And then he says, I understand one of your arguments to be that it required a number of shocks and crises culminating into World War II to overcome unilateral protectionist reflexes and to prepare the ground for the idea of rules-based multilateralism. Could the same be argued in the current situation? For example, could recent shocks like COVID, global value chain disruptions, other things help overcome the current WTO GATT crisis? Or is there a risk that recent developments, China, Russia sanctions, increase the centrifugal forces and tear the multilateral trade system apart?
Yeah, actually, I saw the comment, and thank you very much for the question. In fact, that's sort of what I was trying to answer in the previous answers. I think that's right, and I think that's a good way of thinking about it. There's centrifugal forces and centripetal forces. Forces bring countries together, and forces pulling them apart. Unfortunately, I think all recent crises since the financial crisis have been sort of moving in the direction of pulling countries apart. Countries see more nationalism, see more concerns about national security, economic security, supply chains, vulnerability to foreign partners who won't trade with them. And it's not just US, China, Russia. There was a food crisis in 2011, 2012. Food prices spiked because of some bad harvests, and exporters began restricting their exports of food. Mm-hmm. Well, what is that going to do? If you can't rely on other countries to supply you in times of dearth, in times of scarcity, you're going to say, well, we need to ensure our own food security, and that means subsidizing domestic agriculture. We've just had these shocks that are moving countries pulling away from another than pulling together. The question would be, I guess, what situation or scenario could we see that brings countries back together again? And I think here's where the geopolitics is important. A lot of the GATT was Western Europe and the United States establishing a partnership. And there's no special trade agreement between the US and Western Europe. There was the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and can't remember what that acronym stands for, but I think it's very important to sort of restart those discussions about, we have shared values in so many areas, and we don't want to fight trade wars with one another. And we can form the basis of other countries possibly joining in if the WTO is not perceived as working or moving forward on things that we need to have joint cooperation on.
Mm-hmm. I think that the TTIP issue it fits perfectly to the next question, because this deals with the public support or public non-support for free trade. So Matthias is asking, from my point of view, free trade seems to be unpopular in public opinion, being claimed as cause for problems of globalization. What's your point of view, and how would you advise governments to make trade more popular? Maybe just to add on this, I would personally be a lot interested in two things also from history. So the first one would be on the RTAA that you mentioned, which shifted power to the president. Here my question would be, isn't that nowadays backfiring if you look at presidents like Donald Trump, who uses this for trade wars? And the other one is maybe even more closely related to the question, is on the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, right? Because why have policymakers done such a protectionistic tariff act? I would guess it was popular also then, right? So yes. Are we back in time where just public opinion is not for free trade and we have to accept it and take all the economic costs for that?
So if you look at public opinion polls in the US, they are actually pretty positive, about 2/3, 1/3, in favor of globalization, global engagement, participating in a constructive way as a part of the world economy. So it's not as though protectionism is vastly popular. President Trump's policies regarding trade were not popular in the United States. Led to retaliation against US farm exports. It created higher steel prices, which hurt the competitive position of US steel users, such as the auto industry, the machine tool industry. So protectionism is not popular either. It's always, of course, popular with those who are going to get protected, but more broadly not. That tends to be a very narrow group. When you measure public opinion, obviously people are not always cheering for globalization or freer trade or what have you. It does depend on how you frame the question. So if you say, is trade good for the US? People will say basically yes. It'll be a fairly, there's a Pew poll, a Gallup poll that will indicate that. If you say, should we reduce tariffs through the Trans-Pacific Partnership or TTIP, then you get things that are more divided. So people like the idea of trade in general, but they don't necessarily like the idea of a trade initiative. And so that's an important distinction between the policy and trade itself. And so what that means is it takes political skill to convince the public that a trade agreement is in the national interest. And it's not true just in the United States, it's true in most countries. And that's why you need to invoke foreign policy, peace, international engagement. So what a president would have to say is that to counter China, we need to be part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We need economic engagement in Asia. This will help our exporters, will help our farmers, because it's not just going to be popular in and of itself. Let me talk just one quick statement about globalization around the world. It's in developing countries where you tend to see that have benefited from trade, that you tend to see trade being very popular. In Africa, some parts of Latin America, South Asia, these countries have grown rapidly because they've joined the world economy that they were not previously a part of. They want to be modern. They want access to the newest and best equipment and goods. And so it's not unpopular there. Once again, you can always find industries or workers or segments that will be against it, but it's usually their particular interest, not a more broader view of what public opinion is. Just one last point that you did raise about the Congress versus the president. Yes. You're absolutely right. It has been long thought in the United States that Congress, because they're close to their constituents and they tend to hear from import competing groups, they're protectionists, and presidents have the national interest in view. They're going to be much more in favor of free trade. President Trump broke that long record, and he was a very unusual president.
Yeah, sure. I would agree on that, but in terms of trade policy, at least some respects, especially with respect to China, my impression is it has not changed a lot. The rhetoric is different, of course.
Yes.
So the language changed, but in terms of actual policy making, it seems to be that there is consensus that you have to be tough on China from the US perspective.
You're absolutely right. And the big difference with the Biden administration is they don't want to use tariffs so much. They want to use domestic subsidies. They're not going to keep China out of the market directly. They're going to subsidize domestic industries.
So then we are back with the Inflation Reduction Act and other policy measures that have been introduced.
Exactly.
Thanks a lot for this one. Now I have a question on the failure of the International Trade Organization, whether we can learn something from this for the WTO. So it's again from Manfred Checkolin. He says the Havana Charter tried to go beyond pure trade liberalization, also included progressive issues like labor conditions. This may have contributed to its failure. Is there room for the WTO now getting into urging current issues like climate change? So is again the question whether should it be really a narrow trade type of institution, or do you want to solve all world problems with the trade organization? So I think this is the question.
Well, first of all, Manfred is very well informed. So that's an excellent question, as was the previous one, in terms of understanding what the ITO was trying to do. It had, I believe, over 100 articles trying to deal with all manner of economic activity. And the problem is when you had so many countries negotiating, everyone wanted an opt-out or a special clause that would allow them to either adhere or not to adhere. So that's one reason it was a mess. And he's absolutely right as well that when the US, pardon me, and other countries tried to introduce labor standards, say, into the ITO, there's going to be a lot of dispute over that. And in particular, countries are going to view it as possibly zero sum, or where if the US or tries to foist stronger labor standards on other countries, they're going to be losers and the US will be a winner in some sense. So I think as we think about the WTO, we have to think about those areas where it's not going to be viewed as zero sum, where some countries are giving and other countries are getting, but something where everyone can benefit, either because there's an externality or there's a positive sum aspect to it. And I think climate can be one where you can get together a coalition and consideration of the issues to realize this is a global threat and all countries can benefit from some sort of agreement. If it comes down to, however, something where the US insists other countries have to cut their emissions more than we do, obviously that's a non-starter. So you can't have this disproportionate burden. And you may have to use other issues to get an agreement. So there may be an inequality in one part of the climate agreement, but there's going to be made up elsewhere with technical assistance or financing or things of that sort. But I think that's one where there could be a shared positive sum aspect to a possible agreement.
Yep. I would totally agree. I think that the most difficult story here is, even if you want to do it within WTO or just on any type of multilateral negotiations like climate agreements, is the question of how to distribute the costs, right? Especially with respect to different development stages of different economies. Would argue, well, the US and Europe profited the most from CO2 emissions in terms of their economic development over time. Why should we now pay for reducing CO2 without having the gains from CO2, if you want so, right? I think this is the most difficult topic in this regard.
And one thing the GATT did is they had special and differential treatment for developing countries for many years. So that was that trilemma is getting rid of uniform rules for all. And it was saying that we're giving developing countries a special pass. So I can see something emerging with climate in that way too, saying the US, Western Europe, and other advanced countries agree to a steeper reduction in emissions, but we have a different path for other countries on their level of economic development. Yeah,
but here maybe just the question, of course, is: do you think, given the pure size in terms of membership, as you already mentioned, that actually after the Uruguay round, we don't have to say a lot about the WTO because not much progress. Do you think it would be possible with more than 160 members and veto power for each member in terms of institutional design, that you can reach these type of agreements that would be binding in some regard?
I would not be very optimistic about reaching agreements with so many countries around the table. I would think that plurilateral agreements or clubs within the WTO, having that flexibility would allow much more progress to be made more quickly.
Okay. So maybe we're already kind of moving to the future of WTO in some regard. And here a bit of a pessimistic question, as you have shown in your graph, the 5 different stages of globalization in the 20th century and the 21st century. And we are now going down again with respect to this openness index, right? So what do you expect for the future here? So we are somehow stuck in the... What do you think? How does the globalization or the world trade system will look like in the, let's say, in the 2030s or something like that?
Yeah, as you're absolutely right. I didn't get a chance to talk about periods 4 or 5 very much in the slide here. And once again, since the financial crisis of 2008, we have seen this slide in terms of overall global integration. I would think, period 4 was a very unusual one in terms of world history. And I think I mentioned that before, geopolitics was sort of in abeyance. We had Eastern Europe, China, and other countries joining the system. And so this big ramp up in globalization, and so now we've seen this attenuation. It doesn't mean we're going to go all the way back down, but it does mean that it's the world market's not going to be sort of that source of growth that we saw in the 1990s and 2000s. I do think we're going to see much more regionalized global economy. I think that China is moving in a different direction. I worry a little bit about India. Once again, another huge player, and it's gone a little bit more nationalist under President Modi, Prime Minister Modi. But at the same time, they can benefit from China sort of turning inward more. So India is sort of this pivotal player in some sense. But I think, a lot of countries in Latin America and Africa, they still want to benefit from trade and globalization. They're not so much concerned about the geopolitical rivalry between the US and China. They want to trade with both. And so they'll continue to remain open. They don't have much benefit from closing up because their economies are so small. So I think we're going to see this slight fragmentation of the world economy, but not a big implosion, and not going to way much lower levels of integration than we've seen in the past.
Okay, that's a very, very, very interesting point, because also in Europe, we're talking about this polarization, somehow US here and China there. And so we are sitting in Europe, and we're thinking, of course, a lot about the role for Europe and the European Union in this future scenario. And so I would be particularly interested in a perspective from an outsider from the US. How would you think? What should Europe do now? Or where can we be in the future?
Well, Europe is critical and central because it's one of the large trade blocs in the world. It in some sense stands between the U.S. and China, which to the extent those tensions are very strong, the U.S. is going to be pushing Europe to come with it, and limit its exports of semiconductors, limit its exports of high technology. And Europe has to decide how it wants to position itself, whether you're going to be sort of neutral in between, try to preserve the trade links with China, go completely over to the US side with more restrictions on trade with China, try to provide a constructive forum for the negotiation of a climate agreement, and things of that sort. So obviously, I think given the history, there's a lot of shared values between North America and Western Europe. But also, I think sometimes the US can be a little extreme in terms of its anti-China view, and can ask a lot of its allies in terms of paying an economic price for cutting ties that would serve the US, but not necessarily serve the interests of your own citizens and the world economy more generally. Yeah,
I think this last point is very interesting. I think that, of course, some, at least my impression is that we in Europe are not very strong, at least in terms of formulating our geopolitical, geostrategic goals and targets. And this somehow results that we have difficult to decide on which side to flip more or less. And then we have got some pressure from the US, of course, nowadays. And we're, at least in my impression, following a lot of what the US is demanding from us. I think this is even now accelerated with the Ukraine war, because the US is so important in supporting Ukraine with military aid and stuff like that. So it's helping out in Europe some again, let's say. And so this is something I see as what we are just facing right now. So another question from Manfred, maybe given the time, it might be the last question. So first of all, thank you for the kind remark. One more question regarding regionalism. Could the increase in regional negotiations actually be a benefit for the multilateral by preparing issues so that they are digestible in the 164 member WTO system, or will they turn the WTO dispensable?
Once again, a third very impressive question from Manfred, so quite remarkable. The hope, that would be the hope, that plurilateral or some of these regional or bilateral agreements, TPP, are more advanced than the WTO agreements, and they provide a template that can be adopted by other countries. I think the question will be, the WTO has difficulty with the fisheries agreement, has difficulty with scaling back subsidies for fossil fuels, let alone proactive climate change policies. And obviously, the digital economy, WTO hasn't been able to grapple with many of these issues. The question would be whether more countries seek to join the TPP or will adopt TPP in their own regional arrangements, or whether that can be taken to the WTO. So I think the hope had always been that regional agreements will get sort of folded into the WTO, but I'm not sure that the last 25 years have really shown that to be the case. Once again, because it only takes a few veto players in the WTO to sort of put a stop to these things. So I suspect we're going to see more regional and plurilateral agreements rather than the WTO being strengthened by a lot of what's going on at the regional level.
This fits very nicely to what we discussed before, the trade talks, so that we had Anna Bradford here in the trade talks, because in Europe we have the same hope with the Brussels effect, right? That standards that we are negotiating in our trade agreements might make it to world standards at some point in time, and we are competing over standards, also with the US, also with China. And so I think this is the most problematic part here, is that we actually have too many different standards, that it's easy to bring them on an even more multilateral level, I would suspect, because everybody wants to see the standards in their regional trade agreements and not standards from other economies, I would say. Or what would you say on this?
Yeah, I think your analysis is right on that. Nothing to add.
Thank you very much. So I think we're running out of time. Before concluding this session, I would just like to mention our next two events in the FIW project. So first of all, on July the 4th, we will have the next FIW lecture taking place in the Austrian Ministry of Labor and Economy. The lecture will deal with the question on how industrial policy can support the European Green Deal. So again, some kind of policy intervention in free market story to some respect. This will be on July the 4th at 9:30 at the ministry, and the keynote will be delivered by Roman Stollinger from WU Vienna. And the second event is the workshop on international economic networks, taking place on July 7th and 8th at the University of Vienna. And keynote lectures will be delivered by Mark Melitz from Harvard and Swata Dhingra from the London School of Economics. The detailed program will be sent out in the next couple of days. Now, having said that, Doug, I would like to thank you so much for being with us today. I really enjoyed your presentation and the discussion. And as you said, it's just second best to do it online. So we hope to maybe at one point in time really bring you to Vienna and have some Apfelstrudel together. I would really enjoy this one. Thank you so much, Doug. Enjoy your days. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and enjoy your afternoon in Europe. Enjoy your day in New Hampshire, Doug. Thanks again, and stay safe. All the best.
Thank you very much. It was a great deal of fun.
Bye.